In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one world where they told the settlers the air was breathable. Technically true, you could breathe it. You just couldn't do it for more than about 40 years without your lungs turning into something like wet cloth. He watched it happen to his mother, then to his wife, then to most of the people he ever knew. Never dramatic enough for anyone to call it a tragedy, just a quiet, steady taking apart of a body that still had work to do. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Josk Pellum, labor designation Core 7734 of the Agri-World Kelvasse, a place the Imperium decided exists to grow food. Not food for him. He grows it, he doesn't eat it. He spent his entire life surrounded by more grain than he could eat in 1,000 lifetimes, and been hungry every single day of it. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They told us the air was breathable. Technically, they were right. You could breathe it. You just could not do it for more than about 40 years without your lungs turning into something that resembled wet cloth. I know this because I watched it happen to my mother, and then to the woman I married, and then to most of the people I have ever known. I watched it happen slowly, the way soil erodes, not all at once. Not dramatic enough for anyone to point at and call a tragedy. Just a quiet, steady taking apart of a body that still had work to do. The administratum has me down as Pellum, J, labor designation Core 7734. The J is Josk. The Pellum came from a man I never met. Everything that has happened to me happened inside a stretch of land you could walk across in 6 days if the wind did not knock you down first, and I will finish inside it too. I have never seen a city. I have never seen an ocean. I have never seen a tree that was not in a picture on a propaganda broadsheet promising new settlers a life of pastoral comfort under golden skies. The skies on Kelvasse are not golden. They are the color of old bandages, the color of something that used to be white before it was left in chemicals too long. Kelvasse is an agri-world, which means the Imperium looked at this planet and decided it existed to grow food. Not food for us. We grow food. We do not eat it. What we eat is a different substance entirely, a processed ration paste made from the parts of the harvest that fail quality inspection, mixed with protein powder and whatever nutrient supplements the administratum sees fit to ship in, which is never enough and always late. The grain we grow, the endless gray-white fields that stretch from one horizon to the other, that goes into sealed containers, onto landers, up into orbit and away. I have spent my entire life surrounded by more food than I could eat in 1,000 lifetimes, and I have been hungry for every single day of it. This is not a complaint. Complaints require someone to complain to, and there is no one on Kelvasse who does not already know. It is simply how things are. The Imperium needs food. Kelvasse makes food. The people who make the food are not the people who eat the food. If you think about it long enough, you will find that this is how every system the Imperium has ever built operates, applied with a consistency that would be impressive if it were not applied to you. I was born in a settlement called Core. That is not a name anyone chose. It is a designation stenciled onto a water tank by some administratum clerk a century before I existed, and the people who lived around that water tank needed something to call the place, so they called it Core. It was home to roughly 2,000 people when I was born, which made it a mid-sized settlement by Kelvasse standards. The entire planet had maybe 300,000 souls spread across it, and that number included the servitors, which tells you something about how the administratum counted people. Core consisted of 17 habitation blocks, a processing annex, a chem storage depot, a water reclamation unit, and an ecclesiarchy shrine the size of a storage closet. The shrine held services twice a week, timed to the change of shift, so attending meant either standing for another hour after 12 on the lines or missing the start of your next rotation. Nobody was ever disciplined for not going. Halgut would have had to report it, and reporting it would have meant explaining why his people were short of hours. The man who led them also worked the processing annex, because Core was not large enough to warrant a full-time preacher, and the administratum did not send what was not warranted. I went a few times as a child, holding my mother's hand. I do not remember anything that was said. I remember that the building was cool inside. That was the whole settlement. If you stood on the roof of the tallest hab block, which was 4 stories high and leaned slightly to the east because the foundation had been sinking into degraded topsoil for decades, you could see every building in Core without turning your head. And beyond those buildings, in every direction, nothing but fields. Gray fields under a brown sky, running out to an edge that was not really an edge, just the point where the dust in the air became thick enough that you could not see any further. I do not remember much about my first few years, and I am not going to pretend I do. Some people in stories talk about their earliest memories, like they are recounting something clear and precise. My earliest memories are a blur of heat, dust, the sound of machinery, and the smell of chemical fertilizer so strong it made your eyes water. That last one is the closest thing Kelvasse has to a defining feature: the fertilizer. It is sprayed from dispatch flyers in enormous quantities because a single growing season strips the soil of everything, and without the chemicals nothing would grow at all. The spray settles on everything. On the buildings, on the ground, on your skin, in your mouth. You taste it before you taste your food. After enough years, you stop noticing. It becomes the baseline, the default flavor of existence, and everything else is just a variation on it. My mother worked the chem lines. That meant she spent 12 hours a day mixing the concentrated fertilizer compounds that were pumped into the dispatch flyers. The compounds came in sealed drums, shipped in from off-world, and the mixing was done in an open shed with ventilation fans that had not worked properly since before she was born. She wore a rebreather when they had filters available, which was about half the time. The other half, she breathed it raw. She told me once that when she first started on the chem lines, the fumes made her vomit every morning for 3 months. After that, her body stopped fighting it, which she said was either adaptation or surrender, and she had stopped caring which one. She was not a sentimental woman. She was built the way Kelvasse built everyone, lean and hard and practical, and she loved me in the way that people love things on an agri-world. She would come back from her shift with orange chemical dust in the creases of her knuckles, and she would check whether I had eaten, and she would check whether I had been assigned a task for the next day. And if both answers were yes, she would nod and lie down and sleep. I never knew my father. On Kelvasse, a significant number of children did not know their fathers, and not because of any particular tragedy. People coupled out of proximity and exhaustion, the way workers in any labor settlement do, and sometimes a child resulted, and sometimes the father was reassigned to another work detail or another settlement, or simply died on a shift before the child was old enough to form a memory. My mother never spoke about him. I asked once, when I was maybe 6 or 7. She told me his name was Pellum, which is how I got mine, and that he had been a hopper driver who was killed when his vehicle overturned in a drainage channel during the wet season. She told me this the way you tell someone the time. It was a fact, not a story. I started working when I was 8. That sounds worse than it was, which is the kind of thing only someone from an agri-world would say. On Kelvasse, children started at 8 because that was when you were large enough to be useful and small enough to fit into the spaces between the root beds where the harvester leviathans could not reach. My first job was as a stalk picker. After the leviathans had come through and stripped the fields during harvest season, there was always grain left behind, caught in the root tangles or lying in the drainage ditches or pressed into the mud by the weight of the machines. It was not much, maybe 1% of the total yield, but on a planet-wide scale, 1% was a number worth sending children after. So we went. Dozens of us, sometimes hundreds, crawling through the stubble fields on our hands and knees with canvas sacks tied around our waists, pulling up every stalk and grain head we could find. We worked from first light until the second shift horn sounded, which was roughly 10 hours. We were given one ration bar at midday and water from a tank that followed us on a flatbed pulled by a servitor. The servitor had been a person once, probably someone who had committed some offense against the administratum, but I did not think about that at the time. At 8 years old, servitors were just part of the scenery. Things that moved and did what they were told and smelled faintly of preservative chemicals. I did not understand what they actually were until I was older, and by then understanding changed nothing. The other stalk pickers were children my age, and I suppose you could say they were my friends in the way that people become friends when they share a common misery. We did not play. There was no time for playing, and the fields were not a place for it. What we did was talk when the overseers were not close enough to hear, and what we talked about was mostly the same things every time. Food, what we had eaten, what we wished we could eat, what we had heard the off-worlders ate. One boy named Bren Caswick told me once that on hive worlds, some people ate meat every day, real meat from real animals, not protein paste. And I told him he was a liar because that seemed impossible. He was not a liar. He was also not wrong. But the idea that somewhere in the Imperium, people were eating actual animal flesh on a daily basis while I was crawling through mud to collect dropped grain for a ration bar that tasted like chalk, that idea was too large to hold in my head at 8 years old. I filed it away somewhere and moved on. You learn to do that early on Kelvasse. You learn to not hold on to things that will only make the work harder. Bren became the closest thing I had to a real friend, which on Kelvasses meant someone you chose to work beside, rather than someone you were assigned to work beside. He was a strange one, shorter than me by a full head, thin even by stalk picker standards, with a face that always looked slightly annoyed, as if the entire planet was a personal inconvenience directed specifically at him. He never talked about his parents, which meant either they were dead or they were the kind of people you did not talk about. And I never asked because, on Kelvasse, you did not ask about the things people did not mention. He had a habit of narrating what he was doing while he did it, a low mutter under his breath, as if he were a chronicler recording the events of his own life for some imagined audience. I found it irritating at first and then comforting, the way you find any constant sound comforting when everything else is silence and wind. The settlement of Kor was run by a man called Workmeister Halgut, which was a local title that meant something between foreman and warden. Halgut was not a cruel man. The Imperium does not require cruelty to function. It requires compliance, and compliance is a much quieter thing. Halgut was a short, heavy-set man with a face like weathered rockite and hands the size of grain scoops. He had been Workmeister for as long as anyone could remember. He made sure the quotas were met. He assigned the work details. He distributed the rations. He did that last one himself. Every single time, standing at the distribution point for the full hour, handing out bars and ticking names off the list with a stub of graphite pencil. Other workmeisters in other settlements delegated ration distribution to their foremen because it was tedious, repetitive work that required no skill. Halgut never delegated it. I assumed, as a child, that this was thoroughness. He was the kind of man who did everything himself because he did not trust anyone else to do it correctly. He reported to the prefect, who was the administratum's representative on Kelvasse, and the prefect reported to someone else, who reported to someone else, in a chain that presumably ended somewhere on a desk on Terra, where a clerk had never heard of Kelvasse and never would. Halgut was not kind, but he was fair in the way that a machine is fair. The same rules applied to everyone. You worked your shift, you got your ration, you slept, you did it again. If you could not work, you did not eat. If you refused to work, you were reported. What happened after you were reported depended on the prefect's mood, and the prefect's mood depended on whether the tithe numbers were on target, and the tithe numbers were never on target, so the prefect's mood was never good. I saw it happen once, when I was 10 or 11. A man on the irrigation crews, whose name I knew then and have lost since, stopped going to his shift. He did not shout about it, and he did not tell anyone why. He stayed in his hab block room. Halgut reported him. The report went up, and what came back down was one line adjusting the distribution list. Nobody came for him. Nobody put a hand on him. There were no enforcers in Core, and the only armed men I ever saw on Kelvasse came down with the levy transports, and they came to take people away rather than to keep anyone in line. His name simply came off the sheet. He stood in the queue the first evening and was passed over, and stood in it the second evening and was passed over, and somewhere around the fourth he stopped coming to the queue and went back to the channels instead. He worked another 9 years before something in the water finished him. Nobody discussed it afterward. There was nothing to discuss, and everyone in that queue had watched the whole thing from 4 meters away. The prefect at the time of my childhood was a woman named Surtees. I saw her exactly 4 times in my first 8 years. She lived in the administrative block in Settlement Prime, which was the largest hab cluster on Kelvasse, roughly 40 kilometers north of Core, and she only came to the outer settlements during inspection cycles. When she did come, everything changed for 2 days. The hab blocks were cleaned. The ration distribution was reorganized to look more efficient. The work crews were given fresh rebreather filters, which were taken back after the prefect left. People walked faster and talked less and made sure their chem suits were buttoned correctly, and the whole settlement hummed with a tense artificial energy that evaporated the moment her transport lifted off the landing pad. It was performance. Everyone knew it was performance. The prefect probably knew it was performance, but the performance was part of the system, and the system did not function without it, so everyone performed. I remember the first time I saw the tithe ships. I was 9, maybe 10, and it was the end of harvest season, and someone told me to look up. I did. High above, so high they were barely visible through the orange-brown haze, there were shapes moving. Dark shapes, enormous, blotting out patches of sky like slow-moving clouds. Landers, dozens of them, descending toward the processing hubs to collect the sealed grain containers that had been stacking up all season. Each lander was bigger than Core. Each one carried more food in its belly than our settlement would eat in a decade. They came down, they loaded, they went back up, and the grain went away, and we stayed. I watched them until the dust swallowed them, and then I went back to picking stalks, and I did not think about where the grain went. Not then. You learn not to think about certain things on Kelvasse, the same way you learn not to breathe too deeply on a spraying day. Not because someone tells you not to, because your body figures it out on its own. My mother died when I was 12. She had been coughing for 2 years by then, the deep, wet kind of cough that sounds like something inside is coming loose. The settlement medic, a tired man named Fossick, who had been trained for maybe 6 weeks at some administratum medical facility before being shipped to Kelvasse, told her it was calciumite deposits in her lungs, chemicalite calcium buildup from the fertilizer compounds. He told her this while she was still on shift, because there was no such thing as medical leave. You worked until you could not stand, and then you sat and worked, and then you lay down and stopped. She did it in that order over the course of about 3 months. I was on a stock-picking detail when she died. Our Workmeister Halgut told me during the evening ration distribution, standing in line, the way you tell someone the weather has changed. Your mother is dead. Here is your ration bar. Next, I did not cry. On Kelvasse, crying meant you had stopped working, and if you stopped working, you stopped eating, and if you stopped eating, you joined the person you were crying about faster than you intended. So I ate my ration bar, and I went to sleep in the hab-block room I had shared with her, which was now just mine, and the next morning I went back to the fields. Her body was collected by the settlement processing crew and taken to the reclamation facility. I do not know what happened to it after that. I know what I suspect happened to it, because I know what happens to organic material on a world where nothing is wasted. But suspecting is not the same as knowing, and I have chosen not to know. I was 12 years old, and I was alone, and I was hungry, and I was on a planet that did not care about any of those things. This was Kelvasse. After my mother died, I was reassigned. That is the word the administratum uses. Reassigned, as if you had been in one place by choice and were now being placed somewhere else, also by choice. In practice, it meant that Workmeister Halgut looked at the labor allocation board, saw that the chem mixing detail was short 2 bodies because 2 people had died that month, and moved me and another child, a girl named Ostra, who I barely knew and never got to know, from stock picking to the chem lines. I was 13. The minimum age for chem line work was supposed to be 15. Halgut adjusted the number because the alternative was failing to meet the chemical preparation quota, and failing to meet any quota on Kelvasse carried consequences that no one wanted to test. The chem lines were where the raw fertilizer compounds were mixed before being loaded into the dispatch flyers. The process was simple in the way that most lethal things are simple. Drums of concentrated chemicals arrived at the depot from off-world shipments. Workers opened the drums, measured the compounds according to ratios printed on cards issued by the administratum, combined them in mixing vats that held about 2,000 liters each, and pumped the mixture through filtration tubes into the holding tanks of the flyers. That was the entire job. Measure, pour, mix, pump. The administratum had a longer name for the process. It involved 14 syllables and a classification code. We called it pouring. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. The other 2 weeks were maintenance weeks, when the mixing vats were drained and scrubbed, which was actually worse than the mixing itself, because the residue that built up on the inside of the vats was concentrated enough to blister skin on contact. The compound itself was a thing I never learned the proper chemical name for. The drums were labeled with Mechanicus classification codes that meant nothing to me, strings of letters and numbers that might as well have been a foreign language. We called it the orange, because when it was mixed and aerosolized, it turned the air orange, and when it settled on your skin, it left an orange residue that did not wash off for days. The orange was what made the grain grow. Without it, the depleted soil of Kelvasse would produce nothing. With it, the soil produced just enough grain to fill the tithe containers, year after year, season after season, leaching the ground of whatever was left while the chemicals did the real work. It was a relationship between poison and dirt that somehow resulted in food, and I was one of the people who kept that relationship going. It was 12 hours of pouring caustic liquids in a poorly ventilated shed while wearing a rebreather that was older than I was. The rebreathers we were issued had been manufactured for adults. Mine hung loose on my face, and the seal around my jaw never sat right, which meant that for the entire first year on the chem lines, I was inhaling diluted fumes on every breath. I developed a cough within 3 months, not the deep, wet cough my mother had. A dry, raspy thing, like air moving through a pipe that was too narrow. Fossek, the medic, told me it would go away once my body adjusted. He was wrong. It never went away. It just became part of how I breathed, the same way the orange taste in my mouth became part of how I tasted things. After enough time, you stop noticing the things that are slowly killing you, because noticing would mean you had to do something about it, and there was nothing to do. The other chemline workers were mostly older than me, adults in their 20s and 30s, already showing the signs: yellow fingernails, discolored teeth, a faint tremor in the hands that made it difficult to hold the measuring scoops steady. The woman who trained me, if you could call it training, was a broad-shouldered worker named Deva Rult, who had been on the chem lines for 11 years and looked like she had been there for 40. She showed me how to open the drums without splashing, how to read the ratio cards, how to tell when the mixture was correct by its color because the measuring equipment was unreliable. She did all of this in about 20 minutes. Then she pointed at a row of drums and said, "Those are yours." That was the training. After 11 years, Deva had developed a permanent squint in her left eye and a way of breathing that sounded like she was sipping air through a straw. She did not talk much. Nobody on the chem lines talked much, partly because the noise of the mixing vats made conversation difficult, and partly because talking meant opening your mouth wider than necessary. And opening your mouth wider than necessary meant tasting more of the orange. Bren Caswick had been reassigned too, but not to the chem lines. He went to the irrigation channels, which was considered worse in some ways and better in others. The irrigation work meant spending your shift knee-deep in drainage water that was thick with chemical runoff, clearing blockages and maintaining the flow regulators that kept the fields from flooding. It was wet, cold, miserable work, but the air was cleaner near the water, and the channel workers had lower rates of lung calcification than the chemline crews. They had higher rates of skin lesions and fungal infections instead. But on Kelvasse, you traded one way of falling apart for another and called it a career choice. I saw Bren in the evenings, after shifts, in the narrow space between the hab blocks where people gathered to eat their rations and sit in something resembling quiet. On Kelvasse, quiet was relative. The machinery never stopped, the dispatch flyers were always running, the pumps were always pumping, the processing annex was always grinding, and underneath it all, there was the constant low hum of the atmospheric regulators, the command nodes that kept the weather on its prescribed cycle. But relative to the shift noise, the evenings were quiet, and that was enough. Bren had not changed much since we were stock pickers, except he was taller and his permanent expression of irritation had deepened into something more settled, like a man who had accepted that the universe was specifically designed to inconvenience him and had made his peace with it. He still muttered to himself while he worked. He still talked about the things he had heard about other worlds, bits and pieces gathered from the rare off-worlders who passed through, supply crew on the chemical transports, or tithe ship personnel who sometimes came down to the surface to oversee loading operations. Most of what he heard was probably exaggerated or outright fabricated, But it did not matter. On a world where the most exciting event in any given month was a shift in the wind direction, stories about elsewhere had a weight to them that facts could not compete with. It was Bren who first explained the tithe to me in terms I actually understood. I knew what it was, obviously. Everyone on Kelvasse knew what the tithe was, but knowing it as a fact and understanding it as a system were different things. He told me one evening, sitting with our backs against the water tank that gave Core its name, chewing ration bars that were slightly more stale than usual. He said the tithe on Kelvasse was classified as exactis prima. There were harsher grades than that, he said, and Josk had told him that worlds carrying them did not tend to stay populated for long. It meant that a fixed percentage of the total harvest, and it was a large percentage, was collected every cycle without exception and without negotiation. The percentage was set centuries ago, based on a planetary survey that estimated the yield capacity of Kelvasse under optimal conditions. The problem, Bren said, and this was the part that stuck with me, was that the conditions on Kelvasse had not been optimal in living memory. The soil was worse now than it had been when the tithe was set. The chemical dependency was higher. The yield per hectare was lower. But the tithe number did not change because tithe numbers did not change. They were carved into administratum records on Terra, and changing them would require a petition that would take decades to process, if it was processed at all, and in the meantime the percentage stayed the same, and the people who had to produce that percentage worked harder and ate less. He said this without anger, just observation, like describing the weather. I asked him where he learned all of this. He said he heard it from an irrigation foreman named Josk, who had been on Kelvasse for 30 years, and had once served on a tithe assessment crew before being reassigned here for reasons no one would explain. I asked if it was true. Bren shrugged and said it did not matter if it was true, because whether the tithe was unfair by design or unfair by accident, the result was the same, and the result was us. The years between 13 and 18 are a blur in my memory, and I think that is by design. Not administratum design, though I would not put it past them. I mean the design of the human mind, which has the good sense to compress years of identical days into a single flat impression, so that you do not have to remember each one individually. I worked the chem lines. I ate my rations. I slept. I woke up and did it again. The days had a rhythm that was not unpleasant once you surrendered to it, the way I imagine drowning stops being unpleasant once you stop fighting the water. The seasons turned on Kelvasse, but you would not have known it by looking at the sky or feeling the air. The atmospheric regulators kept the temperature within a narrow range year-round, and the rainfall was controlled by orbital satellites, so there were no surprises. No storms, no cold snaps, no droughts, just the same dusty warmth day after day, with the regulated rain coming down at the prescribed times in the prescribed quantities, falling on fields that had been growing the same crop in the same soil for centuries. The only thing that marked time on Kelvasse was the harvest. The harvest happened twice a year, and it was the closest thing we had to a holiday, though calling it a holiday is generous. What it was, really, was the brief period when the normal work routine was suspended and replaced by a different work routine, and the machinery changed from the steady background hum to something much louder and much closer. The harvester leviathans. I had seen them from a distance as a stalk picker, vast shapes moving across the fields like buildings on treads. Up close, they were worse. Each one was at least 100 meters long, some of them closer to 200, with high metal sides and smokestacks that belched dark exhaust into the already filthy air. They crawled across the fields on tracked undercarriages so wide they left ruts deep enough to stand in. And as they moved, They sucked up everything, every stalk, every grain head, every piece of organic matter that was not nailed down, through intake manifolds that roared with the sound you felt in your teeth rather than heard in your ears. They were not machines in the way I think of machines. They were more like animals. Enormous, blind, stupid animals that ate the world in front of them and left nothing behind. Nobody in Core knew how they worked. That is not a turn of phrase. Adepts came out from Settlement Prime twice a season, 3 or 4 of them in red robes with augmetics moving under the hoods, and they opened panels we were not permitted to stand near, and they did whatever they did inside without anyone watching, and then they sealed the panels and left without having spoken to a single one of us. Our work was the outside. Clear the intake grills, scrape the treads, keep the feed lines from fouling, tighten what could be reached with a hand. If something went wrong past the grill, you shut the machine down and you waited. And the waiting was sometimes 3 weeks, and 3 weeks of a Leviathan standing idle in harvest season came out of the settlement's rations at the end of the cycle. People waited anyway. Opening a machine yourself was not something anyone in Core had ever seen done, and the one account I heard of somebody trying it did not end with the machine being repaired. During harvest, everyone worked. Chemline workers, irrigation crews, processing staff, everyone. We were deployed to the fields to clear debris ahead of the Leviathans, to repair damaged intake manifolds, to keep the feed landers supplied and the internal hoppers clear. The work was dangerous. The Leviathans did not stop for people. They did not have sensors that detected human bodies, or if they did, those sensors had been disabled or broken decades ago and never repaired. Every harvest season, people were killed, crushed under the treads, pulled into the intake manifolds, caught in the pipework. The bodies were not recovered. They went into the Leviathan along with the grain, and from there into the processing vats, and from there into the tithe containers. That was what happened when you put enormous machines and small humans in the same field and told both of them to keep moving. I saw my first harvest death when I was 15. A man named Gerdak, who worked on the same chemline crew as me, was clearing a jammed intake manifold on the forward section of a Leviathan called Thresher 09. The manifold cycled while he was inside it. I was 40 meters away. I heard the machine change pitch, and when I looked, Gerdak was gone. Not dead in a way you could see, just gone. There one moment, not there the next, as if the machine had simply decided he was grain and processed him accordingly. Nobody stopped working. The shift foreman made a note on his data slate, and the Leviathan kept moving, and we kept clearing debris in front of it. And that evening, Gerdak's name was read out during the shift report alongside the day's yield figures, as if both were the same category of information. I went back to my hab block that night, and I sat on my cot and I thought about Gerdak for about 5 minutes. Then I stopped thinking about him because I had a shift in 7 hours, and thinking about dead men did not change anything about the shift. By the time I was 18, I had been on the chem lines for 5 years, and I had the marks to show for it. My fingernails were permanently yellow. The skin on my palms was thickened and cracked from chemical contact. I had the cough, the dry rasp that every chemline worker developed, and I had the faint tremor in my right hand that would get worse over the next 30 years, but was at that point barely noticeable unless you were trying to thread a needle, which I never was because there were no needles on Kelvasse and nothing worth sewing. I was thin, which everyone was, and I was strong, which everyone had to be, and I was alive, which put me ahead of roughly 12% of the people who had started on the chem lines the same year I did. At 18, I was reassigned again. This time to the spray rig crews. I asked for it. That is worth saying because it is the only thing in my life I ever asked for. There was a posting notice on the allocation board, one opening, and I went to Halgut's office and stood in the doorway and told him I wanted it. He looked at me for a while without saying anything. Then he looked past me at the allocation board on the wall, at the column where our ages were listed. He wrote my name down and told me to get back to my shift. I found out later that the other name under consideration had been Deva Rolt, who had trained me on the chem lines, who had 16 years in that shed by then, who had the squint and the straw-thin breathing and every reason in the world to want out of it. She stayed. I went. She lasted another 4 years in that shed, and then she did not, and I heard about it the way you heard about everything here, standing in a ration line while somebody said it to somebody else. The spray rigs were a step up from the chem lines, which meant the work was different rather than better. A spray rig was a vehicle roughly the size of a hab block, mounted on 6 articulated legs that let it walk across the fields without compressing the soil too badly. It carried a pressurized tank of mixed fertilizer compound, the same orange mixture I had been preparing on the chem lines, and dispensed it through a series of nozzles mounted on extendable booms that stretched out 30 meters on either side. The rig walked slowly across the fields, spraying as it went, covering a strip 60 meters wide with each pass. A single rig could cover about 8 square kilometers in a shift, and there were over 200 rigs operating out of the settlements around our sector alone. Each rig had a crew of 3. A driver who sat in the control cab at the front and steered the thing through a set of levers and foot pedals that had been designed for someone with 4 arms and worked adequately for someone with 2. A nozzle operator who sat in a secondary position behind the driver and managed the spray pressure, the boom angle, and the nozzle aperture, making adjustments based on wind speed and crop density. And a maintenance runner who was the unlucky person positioned on the outside of the rig, on a narrow walkway that ran along the length of the tank, responsible for clearing nozzle blockages, tightening boom joints, and doing everything else that required a human body in a place where a human body should not have been. I started as a maintenance runner, because of course I did. Everyone started as a maintenance runner. It was the worst position on the rig, exposed to the full spray, battered by the wind with a constant risk of falling off the walkway onto the ground 4 meters below, where you would either be trampled by the rig's articulated legs or lie in the freshly sprayed field until the exposure killed you or someone noticed you were missing, whichever came first. I will say this for the spray rigs. They moved. After 5 years on the chem lines, standing in the same shed, breathing the same fumes, looking at the same walls, the spray rigs gave me something I had not had before: motion. The rigs walked the fields for 12 hours at a stretch, covering ground, crossing drainage channels, moving through the endless gray-white expanse of grain that made up the surface of Kelvasse. It was different. The horizon moved. The light changed. You saw things. The command nodes, squat metal towers that dotted the landscape every few kilometers, blinking with atmospheric regulation data. The weather dirigibles, enormous gas-filled envelopes drifting at high altitude, maintaining the cloud patterns that kept the rainfall on schedule. The other rigs, distant shapes walking their own paths across the fields, leaving trails of orange mist behind them like slugs leaving slime. And once, just once, I saw a transport ship break through the cloud cover directly overhead, descending toward one of the processing hubs, and for a few seconds its engine wash pushed the haze aside and I saw actual sky. Blue. Not brown, not orange, not the color of old bandages. Blue. I saw it for maybe 5 seconds before the haze closed back in, and then it was gone. I have thought about those 5 seconds more than I have thought about most of the years. I spent 2 years as a maintenance runner before being moved to the nozzle operator position, which happened because the previous nozzle operator, a man named Paul, developed hand tremors bad enough that he could no longer make the fine adjustments required. Paul was moved to light duties, which was the administratum's way of saying he was given tasks that did not require precision, until his body deteriorated enough that he was moved to no duties, which was the administratum's way of saying he was dead. I did not track what happened to Paul after he left the rig crew. The nozzle operator position was better. You were inside the cab behind a sealed viewport, breathing filtered air. The filters were not perfect, but they were better than nothing, which was the standard by which everything was measured. The work was repetitive but required concentration, which I preferred to work that was repetitive and required nothing, because concentration gave your mind something to do besides think. I adjusted nozzle pressure based on wind readings from a gauge that was probably 15 years out of calibration, and I adjusted boom angles based on crop height measurements that were taken once at the start of the season and assumed to be constant throughout. And I did these things with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who knew that getting it wrong meant either underspraying, which would reduce the yield, or overspraying, which would burn the crop, and either outcome would be recorded on the rig's data log and traced back to the operator. My driver was a woman named Merit Drosseln. She was 3 years older than me, which at that age felt significant, and later would not. She had been a rig driver for 4 years, having moved up from maintenance runner in 2 years, rather than my 3, which she mentioned once and never brought up again, though the fact that I remember it tells you something about how I felt about her. Marit was not the kind of person who drew attention to herself. She was medium height, medium build, with dark hair she kept cut short because long hair caught in machinery, and a face that might have been called pretty on a world where people had time and energy to think about such things. On Kelvasse, what mattered about her face was that it was steady. She did not flinch at loud noises. She did not wince when the wind threw debris against the viewport. She drove the rig the way good drivers drive, with an economy of motion that made it look easy, and she did not talk much during shifts, and she did not complain about the food or the hours or the air, and these qualities on Kelvasse were more attractive than anything physical could be. We talked during shift breaks, not about anything meaningful, not at first, about the rig, about the fields, about the other crews, about Workmeister Halgut's latest directive, which was always the same directive: meet the quota, report deviations, do not waste resources. Phrased in slightly different words each time, as if novelty would make compliance more appealing. Gradually, over the course of months that felt like one continuous day, we started talking about other things. She told me she was from Settlement 14 Vedin, about 60 kilometers south of Kor, and had been transferred here after a labor reallocation following a disease outbreak that had killed 30% of Vedin's workforce. She told me she had a brother who had been conscripted into the Astra Militarum during the last tithe levy and shipped off-world, and she did not know where he was or whether he was alive. And she said this the same way my mother had told me about my father. A fact, not a story. I asked her what she thought about during the long hours of driving when the rig was on a straight run and there was nothing to steer around. She looked at me as if the question was strange, which it was, on Kelvasse, where people did not generally ask each other about their interior lives, because acknowledging that you had an interior life was an indulgence that the schedule did not accommodate. She said she thought about the rig, about whether the left forward leg was cycling correctly because it had been making a sound she did not like, about whether the fuel cells would last through the shift, or if she would have to call for a resupply. Stopping meant falling behind the schedule. Falling behind meant a notation on the log. She said she thought about practical things because practical things were the only things that could be changed by thinking about them. I found this answer more appealing than any poetry could have been. We coupled after about 6 months in the quiet way that people coupled here. There was no courtship in any recognizable sense. There was no ceremony. We shared a shift one day, and that evening we shared a ration, and that night we shared a cot, and in the morning we went back to the rig and drove the same route we had driven the day before. A few weeks later, we registered as a paired unit with the Werkmeister, which meant our hab block allocation was adjusted to give us a shared room instead of 2 separate ones, and our ration distribution was consolidated into a single collection point. I do not want to give the impression that I did not care for Marit. I did, more than I have cared for anything else in my life, including my own survival, which is saying something on a world where survival was the only thing you had. But carrying on Kelvasse was a compressed thing, packed tight and kept small, like everything else. You did not have the space for grand feelings. You had the space for the feeling you could carry alongside your work, and that was enough. And if it was not enough, you carried it anyway. What we had were small things. She had a way of tapping her knuckles against my kneecap twice, quickly whenever the rig passed over rough ground, which meant nothing practical and everything else. It meant I am still here. It meant, are you still here? And I would tap back, twice on the edge of the console, without looking at her, and neither of us ever spoke about it or acknowledged that it meant anything, because acknowledging that something mattered was the fastest way to lose it. We did this every shift, every day, for years. Tap, 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 tap. The years on the spray rigs were what I think of as the middle part of my life, the long, flat stretch where nothing happened and everything happened at the same time. We drove the rig. We sprayed the fields. We ate our rations. The harvest came, and the leviathans rolled, and people died in the usual ways, and the tithe ships came and took the grain away, and we stayed. Marit and I had a daughter during the 9th year, and a son during the 11th. I will not talk about them much, not because I do not care, but because the things I care about most are the things I am least able to describe, and describing them badly would be worse than not describing them at all. They grew the way children grew on Kelvasse. Fast, thin, adapted to the air and the chemicals and the noise, learning the rhythms of the work before they learned anything else. Our daughter started as a stalk picker when she was 8, the way I had. The cycle repeated itself, and there was nothing surprising about that, and I did not feel anything about it that was worth mentioning, because what I felt was the same thing every parent on Kelvasse felt, which was a dull, steady ache you carried alongside the cough and the tremor and the taste of the orange. Life on Kelvasse had a texture to it that is difficult to describe to someone who has not lived it. It was not all suffering. There were moments, small ones, worthless by any standard that mattered, but they existed. The evenings between shifts, when the air cooled slightly and the wind dropped and you could sit outside the hab block and eat your ration without hunching against the dust. The sound of the rig's legs on hard ground, a rhythmic clicking that was almost musical if you were tired enough. Marit's voice in the cab calling out course corrections in that flat, steady tone that I came to associate with safety. Bren Caswick sitting on the water tank in Core, telling me some outrageous story he had heard from a supply crew about a world made entirely of water, where people lived in floating cities and ate fish the size of cargo shuttles. These moments were not enough to make the life good, but they were enough to make it bearable, and on Kelvasse, bearable was the highest aspiration anyone had. The food we ate deserves its own mention, because it was central to everything. The ration bars were produced in the processing annex, using the lowest grade grain from the harvest, the stuff that did not meet tithe standards due to discoloration, chemical damage, or contamination. This grain was ground into flour, mixed with synthetic protein powder and vitamin supplements, compressed into bars, and distributed twice daily. Twice daily sounds generous until you hold one in your hand. The bars were gray. They tasted like chalk and something faintly acidic that I was told was the vitamin supplement, but suspected was the chemical residue that permeated everything. They were nutritionally adequate, according to Administratum guidelines, which defined adequate as the minimum caloric and nutrient intake required to sustain a human body performing 12 hours of physical labor. Not the optimal intake, not the recommended intake, the minimum. We ate the minimum every day for our entire lives, and the food we grew with our hands and our lungs and our slowly failing bodies went somewhere else, to feed people who would never know our names or our world or the color of our air. There was a particular cruelty to this that I think only people on agri-worlds truly understand. On a forge world, the workers produce weapons and machinery. They do not eat weapons and machinery, so the fact that their product leaves the world is not felt as a personal loss. On a mining world, the workers extract ore. They do not eat ore. But on an agri-world, you produce food, actual food. You grow it, you harvest it, you process it, and you watch it loaded onto ships, and then you go back to your hab block and eat a gray bar that was made from the parts of the food that were not good enough for the people who will eat the food you made. You spend your life feeding people you will never meet, and you do it while hungry. The propaganda was something I never got used to. Every few years, a supply ship would bring a fresh batch of broadsheets and vid cards from some Administratum propaganda bureau, and they would be distributed through the settlements like rations. The broadsheets showed images of agri-worlds that bore no resemblance to Kelvasse. Green fields, blue skies, workers smiling in clean clothes, standing beside overflowing baskets of golden grain, looking healthy and well-fed and content. The text underneath said things like, "The Emperor's bounty begins with you," and "Serve the Imperium," "Feed the future," and other phrases that sounded like they had been written by someone who had never been within 100 light-years of an actual agri-world. The vid cards were worse because they moved. Short loops of smiling families walking through orchards that did not exist, eating meals that were not ration bars, breathing air that was not orange. They were recruitment material, designed to convince people on hive worlds and overcrowded settlements to sign up for indentured labor on agri-worlds. And apparently they worked, because every few years a transport would arrive in orbit and a few hundred new workers would make planetfall, blinking in the dusty light, looking around at the flat gray fields and the brown sky, and the hab blocks that looked like they had been dropped from orbit and left where they landed. And you could see the moment it hit them. The moment they understood that the vid card was a lie, and that this was permanent, and that the transport that brought them here would not be taking them back. There was no word for that moment. There should have been. The new arrivals were called dust fresh, which was the closest thing Kelvasse had to humor, and they were sorted into work details within hours of landing. There was no orientation. The walk from the landing pad to the hab blocks was the orientation. Most of them were broken within a month. Not physically, though that came later. Mentally. The adjustment from believing you were going to a paradise to understanding you were in a labor camp was too sharp for some people, and they simply stopped. Stopped working, stopped eating, stopped responding. They sat in their hab blocks and stared at the walls and waited for something to change, and nothing changed. And eventually they either started working again, or they were classified as non-productive and dealt with accordingly. which meant different things at different times depending on the current prefect's interpretation of the labor regulations. Under Prefect Surtees, non-productive workers were given 3 days of reduced rations as incentive to resume their duties. Under the prefect who replaced her, a man named Voskin, who arrived from off-world when I was in my late 20s, non-productive workers were reassigned to penal details, which meant the worst jobs on the worst fields with the shortest life expectancy. The result was the same either way. People worked or they disappeared. Prefect Voskin was the first person I ever met who seemed to genuinely enjoy the Administratum's systems. Surtees had been indifferent, a bureaucrat fulfilling a function. Voskin was something else. He was a tall, thin man with augmetic lenses over both eyes that made him look like a machine wearing a human face, and he spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who had been educated at an administratum schola and had absorbed every lesson as literal truth. He believed in the tithe the way the ecclesiarchy believed in the emperor, not as an obligation but as a sacred duty, a divine function, a thing that was right and good and necessary in a way that transcended any individual's suffering. He visited the settlements more often than Surtees ever had, not to inspect but to observe, standing at the edge of the fields in his clean gray coat, with his augmetic eyes whirring and clicking, watching the workers the way a tech priest watches a machine, assessing efficiency, identifying waste. He was not cruel. Cruelty requires malice, and Voskin had no malice. He had conviction, which was worse. Under Voskin, the quotas tightened. Not dramatically, not all at once, in increments, small adjustments to the yield expectations, a percent here, a fraction there, each one justified by a data analysis that showed Kelvasse was theoretically capable of producing more than it currently was. The analyses were correct, in the way that a map is correct when it shows a straight line between 2 points without accounting for the mountain in between. Kelvasse could produce more grain. It just could not produce more grain without working the existing population harder, and the existing population was already working at what even the Administratum's own guidelines would have classified as maximum sustainable output, if anyone had bothered to check the guidelines against the reality. Nobody checked. The numbers went up, the expectation went up, the output went up, and the people underneath it all compressed a little further and a little further, like soil under a leviathan's treads, getting thinner and denser and harder until eventually there was nothing left to compress. The military tithe came every few years, irregular and unpredictable, which made it worse than the harvest tithe, because at least the harvest tithe was constant. You could plan around a constant. You could not plan around a levy that arrived without warning and took a percentage of your able-bodied population and shipped them off to fight a war you had never heard of on a world you could not pronounce. The selection was thorough. They checked your teeth, your eyes, and whether you could lift a grain sack above your head. Nobody checked whether you could shoot. The levy was managed by the Departamento Munitorum, not the Administratum, which meant a different set of officials with a different set of priorities and a different interpretation of what constituted a reasonable demand. The Munitorum did not care about crop yields. They cared about bodies. Warm, functional, able to hold a last gun and follow orders. Every person they took was a person who would not be working the fields the next day. The remaining workers absorbed that person's share of the labor. Longer shifts, higher individual quotas. More accidents, more burnout, more deaths. Fewer workers for the next levy. Each levy took a larger percentage of a smaller pool. I was never levied. The allocation system classified spray rig operators as essential agricultural personnel, which carried a temporary exemption from conscription for as long as you held the position. That exemption was the only reason anyone wanted the rigs, and the reason people stayed on them long past the point where the chemicals were finishing them. Better to die slowly on a rig than quickly in a trench on some world whose name you would forget before the transport reached orbit. Bren was not exempt. He was on the irrigation crews, which were not classified as essential. When the levy came in my 27th year, his name was on the list. I found out during the evening ration distribution, the same way I found out everything. Someone told me while we were standing in line. Bren was being shipped off-world in 3 days. The Munitorum transport was already in orbit. 47 people from the core sector had been selected, and Bren was number 31 on the manifest. I went to find him. He was sitting on the water tank, which was where he always was in the evenings, and he was not muttering to himself, which was how I knew something was different. He was quiet, looking at the fields, and when I sat down beside him, he said, without turning to look at me, that he had always assumed he would die on Kelvasse, that everyone assumed they would die on Kelvasse, because that was what happened to people on Kelvasse. You were born here and you died here, and the grain grew over your grave, if you got a grave, which you did not. And now, apparently, he was going to die somewhere else. He said it like it was an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict. Bren Caswick, who had been my friend since we were 8 years old, crawling through stubble fields with canvas sacks around our waists, sitting on a water tank in the brown evening light, annoyed at the Imperium for ruining his plans to die in the same unremarkable place where he had been born. I asked him if there was anything I could do, which was a stupid question, and we both knew it. He said yes, there was one thing. He asked me to keep his hab block space reserved for him, to tell the workmeister that Bren was coming back and would need his rack when he returned. We both knew he was not coming back. People who were levied from Agri-Worlds did not come back. They went into the Guard, and the Guard went to war, and war went on forever, and that was the end of it. But he asked me to keep his space reserved, and I said I would, and we sat on the water tank until it was time to sleep, and in 3 days, Bren was gone. I kept his rack reserved for 2 years before Werkmeister Halgut finally told me to stop being ridiculous and gave it to a dust-fresh arrival from the last transport. That was the year I noticed the discrepancy. Not a big one. Not the kind of thing that shouts at you, the kind that whispers, and you hear it only because the rest of the world is so monotonous that any variation in the signal stands out. I was reviewing the daily spray log, which was part of my duties as nozzle operator, comparing our rig's coverage against the sector allocation map that Werkmeister Halgut posted at the start of each season. The map showed the fields assigned to each rig crew, broken into numbered parcels. Our rig, Spray Unit 17, was assigned parcels 440 through 478, a long strip running east from core toward the drainage basin. But the allocation map listed 39 parcels, and when I counted the actual parcels on the ground, the ones we physically drove through, there were 43. 4 extra parcels that were not on the map. Fields that were being sprayed and harvested, but did not officially exist. I mentioned it to Marit that evening. She listened, and then she told me to stop counting. Not in a way that suggested she did not believe me. In a way that suggested she already knew, and had known for a while, and had decided that the knowing was not worth the cost of acting on it. So I stopped counting. But I did not stop noticing. Over the next several years, I noticed other things, small things, the kind you only see when you are looking sideways. The ration portions were not perfectly consistent. Some weeks they were fractionally larger, barely enough to register, and those weeks always seemed to coincide with the end of harvest, when the phantom fields would have been producing their off-the-books yield. The processing annex ran extra shifts at odd hours after the official production log had been closed for the day, and the workers who ran those shifts were the same people whose names I could not find on any allocation board. I saw Workmeister Halgut walking the perimeter of the settlement after dark, twice, heading toward the eastern fields where the phantom parcels were, and when I asked him about it the next day, he told me he was checking the drainage sluices, which was not his job and never had been. None of these things individually meant anything. Together, they formed the outline of a system that I was not supposed to see, and so I did what Marit had told me to do. I looked away. I ate my ration. I did not ask questions that would produce answers I could not afford to carry. The census came in my 34th year. I remember the date because it was the only time in my life that something happened on Kelvasse that no one had predicted. The administratum operated on cycles: tithe cycles, supply cycles, levy cycles. Everything was scheduled, and even when the schedule was bad, it was at least known. The census was not scheduled. It was ordered from somewhere high up the chain, some administratum bureau on some sector capital world responding to some data inconsistency that had been flagged by some audit process that had been running probably since before I was born. The order came down through channels, through sub-sector command, to sector administration, to planetary governance, to Prefect Voskin. And Voskin received it the way a weapon receives ammunition, with purpose. The census teams arrived on a bulk transport that also carried fresh chemical supplies and replacement parts for the atmospheric regulators, which meant it was officially a routine supply run. The census officials were embedded in the supply crew like parasites in a host. 16 administratum clerks with data slates and biometric scanners, and the particular expression of people who had been trained to count things and had never been asked to care about the things they were counting. They spread across the settlements in pairs, 2 clerks per hab cluster, and they counted every person, every structure, every piece of equipment, every field. In core, the census pair was a man and a woman whose names I never learned and do not need to know. They set up a station in the processing annex and ordered all personnel to report for biometric registration over the course of 3 days. The biometric registration involved a retinal scan, a gene sample, and a data slate entry that recorded your name, your assigned settlement, your work detail, your age, and your parentage. It was thorough in the way that only imperial bureaucracy could be, and it was that thoroughness that created the problem. The official population of Core, according to administratum records, was 1,912. This number had been the official population for something close to 40 years, adjusted occasionally for recorded deaths and the rare recorded birth. The actual population of Core, the number of living human beings who woke up every morning in those 17 hab blocks and went to work in those fields and ate those ration bars and breathed that air, was 2,841. 929 people who did not exist, not dead people, living people, breathing, working, eating people who had been born in Core, grown up in Core, and worked in Core without ever being registered in the administratum's records. They were the children and grandchildren of people who had, at some point in the past, chosen not to register a birth. The reasons were practical. Every registered person was a data point. Every data point affected the calculations. More registered people meant higher labor quotas, higher ration requirements, higher tithe assessments. By not registering a birth, a family could keep a child off the books, which meant one fewer person counted in the labor pool, which meant a slightly lower quota for the settlement as a whole. The child would still work, of course. Everyone worked, but they worked invisibly, their output absorbed into the collective total without being individually tracked, and their ration share came from the collective distribution rather than from a personal allocation. It was survival mathematics, practiced at the household level, passed down from generation to generation like a trade skill. Do not register the child. The child works anyway. The numbers stay manageable. Everyone eats, barely. The phantom fields were part of the same system. The 4 extra parcels I had noticed were not an accident. They were deliberately unregistered cultivation zones, tended by the unregistered workers, producing grain that never appeared on any tithe report. This grain was consumed locally, mixed into the ration processing, supplementing the officially allocated food supply with just enough extra calories to keep people functional. It was not much. Maybe an extra 200 calories per person per day, which does not sound like a lot, until you understand that 200 extra calories was the difference between slow starvation and survival. The entire system, the unregistered births, the phantom fields, the quiet mathematics of subsistence, had been running for decades, maybe longer. It was an open secret in the way that all essential lies are open secrets. Everyone knew. Nobody said it. The knowing and the not saying were the same act, and that act kept Core alive. The census ended that, not immediately, not with a dramatic confrontation or a public accusation. With arithmetic. The census clerks counted the people. They counted the fields. They fed the numbers into their data slates and transmitted them to Prefect Voskin, and Voskin compared them to the existing records, and the discrepancy was exactly as large and exactly as damning as everyone had known it would be the moment the census was announced. 929 unregistered persons, 4 unregistered cultivation parcels, an estimated 12 to 15% deviation between reported yield and actual yield, sustained over an unknown number of years. In the administratum's language, this was classified as a Category 3 tithe irregularity, which was a phrase that sounded like a filing error and meant something much closer to a death sentence. Voskin came to Core personally. He stood in the processing annex, the same room where the census clerks had set up their biometric station, and he addressed the settlement through the address system. His voice was calm. It was always calm. He explained that the census had revealed significant irregularities in Core's population records and cultivation allocations. He explained that these irregularities constituted a violation of Imperial tithe law, which required accurate reporting of all productive assets, including personnel. He explained that the standard remedy for a Category 3 tithe irregularity was retroactive assessment, which meant the tithe would be recalculated based on the actual population and actual cultivation area, and the difference between what had been paid and what should have been paid would be assessed as a debt, to be recovered through increased tithe obligations over a period determined by the administratum. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not need to. The numbers did the threatening for him. The new tithe assessment was 63% higher than the old one. 63%. Applied immediately, non-negotiable, sustained until the retroactive debt was cleared, which, based on the estimated duration of the irregularity, would take approximately 40 years. 40 years of producing 63% more grain with the same land, the same equipment, and a population that was now, for the first time, fully documented and therefore fully accountable. The effect was immediate. Ration allocations were cut to redirect more grain to the tithe. Shift lengths were extended from 12 hours to 14. Rest days were eliminated. The phantom fields were absorbed into the official cultivation map, which meant they were now subject to the same tithe percentage as everything else, which meant the extra grain that had been feeding people was now going into the tithe containers instead. The 200 extra calories per day vanished. Just like that. The margin that had kept core alive was taken away by the same system that had made the margin necessary in the first place. People started dying faster, not dramatically, not in ways that would draw attention from anyone who was not paying close attention, but faster. More workplace accidents, because 14-hour shifts on insufficient calories produce errors, and errors around heavy machinery produce deaths. More respiratory failures, because malnourished lungs process chemical exposure less efficiently. More people simply not waking up, lying in their cots in the morning, still and cool. Done. The settlement medic, a replacement for old Fossick who had died years earlier, reported the deaths with clinical precision and no comment. Cause of death, systemic organ failure. Cause of death, acute respiratory arrest. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, industrial. Each death was recorded, filed, and transmitted to the prefect's office, where it was processed as a data point in the ongoing productivity analysis. The analysis showed correctly that core's output per worker was declining, which it attributed to insufficient motivation and recommended addressing through tightened oversight. The fact that the workers were dying because they were being worked to death on starvation rations was not part of the analysis, because the analysis did not include variables for human endurance. It included variables for output, quota, and compliance. The humans were assumed to be constant. My daughter was 7 when the census happened. She had been unregistered. Marit and I had not registered her birth for the same reason no one registered births on Kelvasse, because the mathematics of survival required it. When the census forced registration, our daughter became a data point, and that data point had consequences. Her existence increased our household's labor obligation, which meant Marit and I were expected to produce more to compensate for a dependent who was not yet old enough for a full work assignment. In practice, this meant longer shifts for both of us. Marit took additional hours on the rig. I took maintenance shifts after my nozzle operator duties. We slept less. We ate the same amount, which was less than before. We did not discuss it. There was nothing to discuss. Marit raised it once, about a month after the Phantom Fields went on to the official map, on the rig without turning her head. She said we should stop putting anything from our own bars onto the children's, because whatever had been making up the difference was gone now and was not coming back, and that if we kept it up, we would go down before they did. That was the whole of what she said about it then, or ever. The system had been adjusted, and we adjusted with it, the way soil adjusts to the weight of a machine. By compressing. Workmeister Halgut, to his credit or his shame, depending on how you look at it, tried to argue the new assessment. He filed a formal petition through the proper channels, pointing out that the increased tithe was unsustainable given the settlement's infrastructure and manpower. I read it years later in the same drawer where he kept everything else he never mentioned again. The petition was acknowledged, processed, and denied in the span of 4 months, which was actually fast by administratum standards. The denial was accompanied by a note suggesting that if Core's existing infrastructure was insufficient to meet the revised tithe, the settlement should request an infrastructure improvement allocation, which could be applied for through a separate petition process with an estimated processing time of 6 to 8 years. Half of us would be dead by then, but the petition would arrive on schedule. Halgut read the denial, put it in his desk, and never mentioned it again. That night I saw him standing outside the processing annex, looking at the fields, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look tired. Not physically tired, which he always was. Tired in the way that people get when they realize the thing they have been pushing against has no intention of moving. The unregistered workers were integrated into the official labor pool, which sounds like a neutral administrative action, and was, in practice, a punishment. Being registered meant being tracked. Tracked meant individually accountable for output. Individually accountable meant that any shortfall was noted, and noted shortfalls accumulated, and accumulated shortfalls triggered consequences. The people who had lived their entire lives as invisible components of a collective system were suddenly visible, suddenly individual, suddenly responsible for meeting targets that had been calculated for them by people who had never held a spray nozzle, or lifted a grain sack, or breathed air the color of rust. Some of them could not meet the targets. They tried, they worked longer and harder, and ate less, and slept less, and their bodies, already weakened by a lifetime of subsistence nutrition and chemical exposure, broke down faster than the system's expectations could accommodate. They died the way everyone on Kelvasse died, one at a time, without anyone stopping to note that the rate had increased because nobody was measuring the rate. The administratum measured output. Output was stable, therefore everything was working as intended. Nobody rebelled, nobody organized, nobody stood up in the processing annex and delivered a speech about justice or fairness or the rights of imperial citizens. Rebellion was not a concept that existed in our vocabulary. You cannot rebel against the weather. You cannot organize against the chemical composition of the soil. The Imperium was not an authority that could be challenged. It was the condition of existence. It was the air you breathed, and the ground you stood on, and the sky above you. Challenging it would be like challenging gravity. Technically possible, I suppose, for someone with resources and knowledge and options. We had none of those things. We had our hands and our lungs, and the orange dust in our coughs, and we had each other. That was not enough for rebellion. The years after the census were the worst years. The increased tithe ground core down the way the Leviathans ground the fields, slowly, systematically, without malice or mercy. People died, and the gaps they left were filled by the remaining workers, taking on additional load. And the additional load created more gaps, and the gaps were filled again, and the process continued in a descending spiral that the administratum's productivity reports classified as stable because the total output remained within the revised target parameters. The people were not stable. The output was, and those were different things that the system treated as the same thing. I was promoted to rig driver when I was 37, after Marit was reassigned to a ground-based logistics role because her lungs had deteriorated to the point where she could not safely operate in a sealed cab for a full shift. The irony of that should not be lost. The cabs were sealed to protect the crew from the spray chemicals. Marit's lungs were damaged by decades of exposure to those same chemicals from before the cab seals were installed on the older rig models. She was being removed from protection because protection had arrived too late. I took over the driver's position, and a new nozzle operator was assigned, a young man named Carl Oraton, who had just come off the maintenance runner. Rotation, and had the particular wide-eyed attentiveness of someone who had not yet learned that attentiveness was not going to save him. He asked questions, real ones, about how the rig worked and why it worked that way. Not the kind people ask to fill a silence. I answered the first few and then stopped, because answering encouraged him. And encouragement was not a favor you did anyone here. I trained him the way Marit had trained me, quickly, practically, without sentiment. He would be fine or he would not. The rig did not care which. 2 years later, Workmeister Halgut died. He did not die dramatically. He died the way most people on Kelvasse died, in stages, each one slightly worse than the last, until the final stage was so close to the one before it that the transition from alive to dead was barely perceptible. He had been workmeister since before I was born. He had managed Corps through droughts, equipment failures, levy demands, the census, the tithe increase, and all the small daily disasters that make up life on an agri-world. He had done this competently, without complaint, without imagination, and without any visible indication that he considered it remarkable. When he died, the settlement processing crew collected his body, the same way they collected every body, and his hab block room was cleared and reassigned within 2 days. Nobody touched the administrative office. The office was not his. It belonged to the position, and the position was still open, so the door stayed shut until someone was assigned to walk through it. Within a week, the only evidence that Halgut had ever existed was the labor allocation records that bore his designation stamp. His replacement was me. I do not know why. I assume it was because I had been on the spray rigs for over 20 years and had maintained acceptable performance metrics throughout, and because Prefect Voskin preferred to promote from within rather than import personnel from other settlements, a process requiring a labor transfer authorization that he did not want to wait for. The promotion was communicated to me the way everything was communicated on Kelvasse. During ration distribution, someone told me in line, "You are the new workmeister. Report to the administrative office tomorrow for briefing. Here is your ration bar." Next. I did not want the job, not that it mattered. Being workmeister meant leaving the rig, which I had come to think of as the closest thing to a tolerable existence that Kelvasse offered. It meant spending my days in the administrative office, managing labor allocations, ration distributions, equipment maintenance schedules, and the daily data reports that were transmitted to Prefect Voskin's office. It meant being responsible for Corps' output, not contributing to it, being responsible for it. There is a difference between carrying weight and being the person who decides how the weight is distributed, and I was not sure I wanted to be on the deciding side of that line. But wanting was not a factor in the decision. The administratum had designated me workmeister. So I reported to the administrative office, and I sat in Halgut's chair, which still smelled like him, and I opened the desk drawers, and I found the records. The records were kept in a series of bound data ledgers, physical books with handwritten entries that supplemented the data slate reports transmitted to the prefect. The data slates contained the official numbers, the ones that went into the administratum's systems and determined the tithe assessments and labor quotas. The ledgers contained a different set of numbers, the real ones. I understood what I was looking at within the first hour. I had spent 20 years reading spray logs against allocation maps. The yield figures in the data slate reports, the ones that Halgut had been transmitting to the prefect for years, did not match the yield figures in the ledgers. The discrepancy was not large. It was not the kind of gap that would show up in a cursory audit. It was a consistent 5 to 8% inflation, applied across every reporting period, smoothed to avoid obvious patterns, distributed evenly enough that no single entry looked suspicious on its own. Halgut had been reporting that Corps was producing more grain than it actually was. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Halgut was a practical man, not a subtle one, and the idea that he had been deliberately falsifying reports for years seemed inconsistent with the rigid, machine-like fairness that had defined his tenure. But the more I looked, the more deliberate the pattern became. The inflation was too consistent to be error. It was too carefully distributed to be carelessness. It was a system within the system, a quiet, methodical lie maintained over what appeared to be at least 15 years and probably longer. Halgut had been reporting yields that Corps could not actually achieve, and the only way to make the numbers work was to reduce the grain allocated for worker consumption by a corresponding amount. 5 to 8% of the total yield diverted from rations to the reported output every cycle for years, which meant these books had been sitting in this building when the census came. 16 clerks, 3 days, counting people and hectares and equipment down to the spare nozzle heads in the maintenance shed, and the books were still here in my hands. So wherever Halgut had put them for those 3 days, it had been good enough. I have never found out where. I have wondered since whether he slept. I looked at the ledgers and I understood why the ration bars had always seemed slightly smaller than the official allocation spec. Because they were. Not by much. Not enough that any single person would notice a difference from one cycle to the next. But enough that it had to come from somewhere, and for 15 years it came out of the phantom fields. Nobody ever felt it going. Then the census took the fields and the 6% stayed, and it started coming out of people instead. Halgut had been maintaining an output fiction that kept the administratum from looking too closely at Core's real production capacity, and I understood, finally, why he had always handled ration distribution himself. Every single day, standing at that distribution point for a full hour, handing out bars and ticking names. He was not being thorough. He was being precise. He was making sure every bar was exactly the right size, exactly the right amount smaller than it should have been, because if anyone else handled the distribution, they might notice the discrepancy, and then the questions would start, and the questions would lead to the ledgers, and the ledgers would lead to the end of Core. Halgut had stood at that table every day for 15 years, looking his people in the eyes while he handed them rations he had personally shaved down to keep them alive by keeping them hungry. Not cruel, not kind. Necessary. I should have been angry. What I felt was something closer to understanding, because I saw immediately and clearly why Halgut had done it. If the reported yields had matched the actual yields, the administratum would have classified Core as underperforming. Underperforming settlements were subject to enhanced oversight, labor restructuring, and potential dissolution, which meant the population would be broken up and distributed to other settlements as replacement workers. Halgut had been lying to keep Core from being disassembled. He had been taking food from his people's mouths to keep the people and the mouths in the same place. He had been choosing slow starvation over dispersal, a quiet death over a loud one, and he had made that choice every single day without telling anyone, and he had died with the lie still running, and now it was mine. I could have reported it. I could have taken the ledgers to Prefect Voskin and explained the discrepancy and let the system deal with it the way the system dealt with everything, which was efficiently and without regard for the people caught in the machinery. The result would have been predictable. Core would be flagged for a secondary audit. The real yields would be established. The settlement would be classified as chronically underperforming. Restructuring would follow. The people I had grown up with, worked beside, married among, raised children among, would be scattered to other settlements across Kelvasse, absorbed into other labor pools, reduced to data points on other workmeisters' allocation boards. I got up and went to the window. The administrative office had one facing north, and through it you could see the ration distribution point. A folding table under a corrugated awning, empty at that hour, the queue posts still standing on either side of it. I had been in that queue when I was 12 years old, and somebody told me my mother was dead and handed me a bar and said, "Next." I looked at it for a while. Then I sat back down. I closed the ledgers. I put them back in the desk. And I thought about what the census had done to Core 5 years ago. The census had punished us for hiding production, for growing extra grain and feeding it to our own people instead of sending it to the tithe. And the entire time that deception had been running, the entire time the phantom fields had been quietly keeping us alive, Halgut had been running the opposite deception on top of it. telling the administratum that Core produced more than it actually did, which meant taking food away from the same people that the Phantom Fields were trying to feed. Two lies pointing in opposite directions, layered on top of each other, and between them in the narrow space where they overlapped. That was where Core existed. That was the margin. Halgut had been managing both ends for years, and nobody had known except him, and now he was dead and nobody knew except me. There was one more thing, and it sat worse than the rest. He had petitioned against the tithe increase. He had written to the administratum that Core could not produce what was being demanded of it, that the settlement's infrastructure and manpower would not sustain the assessment, and every yield report he had filed before that petition had said Core was producing more than it did. He had spent 15 years telling them we were strong, and then one afternoon he had told them we were not, and they believed the 15 years. He had built the wall that the petition broke against. I do not think he understood that until he read the denial, and I think that is what I saw on his face that night outside the processing annex. And I think he carried it for the 2 years he had left and told nobody, because there was nobody to tell. The next morning, I sat down with the data slate and I entered the day's yield figures, and I inflated them by 6%, the same way Halgut had. And I transmitted the report to Prefect Voskin's office, and I did not think about it for the rest of the shift. That is not true. I thought about it constantly. The lie was mine now. I fed it the way I fed the rig. Mechanically, without devotion. I was workmeister of Core. I managed the labor allocations. I distributed the rations. I maintained the lie. I did it the way Halgut had done it, and whoever came before Halgut on ration bars 6% smaller than they should have been. I maintained the ledgers for 19 years. During that time, I buried Marit. I watched my children grow into workers, and I sent hundreds of yield reports to Prefect Voskin's office, every single one of them inflated by the same careful margin that Halgut had established. The lie became routine, the way everything on Kelvasse became routine. I did not agonize over it. I did not lie awake at night, wrestling with the morality of it. I entered the numbers. I transmitted the report. I moved on to the next task. Agonizing would have required energy that I needed for staying alive, and staying alive was getting harder. Mariti lasted longer than most people in her condition, which is a way of saying she died slower. Her lungs had been failing for years, the calciumite deposits building up in layers like sediment in a drainage channel, gradually reducing the space available for air. She breathed in smaller and smaller sips, and she coughed in longer and longer fits, and her skin took on the gray-yellow tint that all chem line workers eventually acquired, the badge of a body that had absorbed more chemicals than it could process. She continued working, because on Kelvasse you continued working. She was moved from logistics to data entry, sitting in the processing annex, recording weight measurements from the grain scales, because it was a job that could be done while seated and did not require deep breathing. She did it well. She did everything well. That was the tragedy of Marit, though I am not sure tragedy is the right word. She was good at things, and none of the things she was good at could save her from the thing that was killing her. She died in our hab block room, in the cot we had shared for 22 years, in the middle of the night between shifts. I woke up because the sound had stopped. Not a sound, the sound. The sound of her breathing, which had become, over the last few months, a thin, continuous whistle, like air being forced through a crack in a sealed pipe. I had gotten used to falling asleep to that sound, the way you get used to falling asleep to the hum of the atmospheric regulators. It was background noise. It was the sound of her being alive. And then it stopped, and the silence woke me up, and I reached over and touched her shoulder, and her skin was cool, and I knew. I lay there for a while. I do not know how long. Long enough that the shift horn sounded and the hab block began to stir, and the sounds of other people waking up and preparing for their day filtered through the thin walls. I reached over one more time and I tapped my knuckles against her kneecap, twice, under the blanket. Tap, tap. She did not tap back. I got up. I dressed. I reported Marit's death to the processing crew, and I went to the administrative office, and I sat in my chair, and I entered the day's yield figures, and I inflated them by 6%, and I transmitted the report. Then I sat there for a while longer, doing nothing, thinking nothing, being nothing, until the next task required my attention, and I did that too. People told me they were sorry. Some of them meant it. On Kelvasse, sympathy was a real thing, but a small thing, the way everything was small. People had their own losses, their own coughs, their own slow declinations. They could spare a sentence for yours and no more. And that was not coldness. That was the economy of emotional resources in a place where every resource was rationed. I appreciated the sentences I received. I did not need more than that. The years after Marit were the emptiest, not the worst, because by that point I had a refined understanding of how degrees of bad worked, and the worst was still the census year. But the emptiest. I worked. I maintained the ledgers. I distributed the rations that I knew were insufficient. I managed the labor allocations that I knew were unsustainable. I watched new dust-fresh arrivals appear and be ground down and either adapted or disappeared. And I watched children grow up and take their parents' places on the chem lines and the spray rigs and the irrigation channels. And I saw in their faces the same dull acceptance that I had seen in my own reflection years ago. Voskin came to Kor many times over the years, the way he came to all the settlements, standing at the edge of the fields in his gray coat, with his lenses clicking, watching the work. Prefects on most worlds rotate out after a decade. Voskin never did, and nobody I ever asked could tell me whether that was because he had requested it or because nobody else wanted Kelvasse. He only came inside the administrative office once. He was touring the sector ahead of a tithe cycle review. Kor was on the route, and he spent about 40 minutes with me while his transport took on fuel. He stood roughly where I am sitting now. He asked to see the reporting history, and I brought it up on the data slate. And he went through it with his lenses adjusting and readjusting, season after season of yield figures, and the drawer with Halgut's ledgers in it was against his left leg the entire time. I had thought once about opening that drawer in front of him. It was the only chance I ever had to do it, and I did not take it. And I have never been able to say afterward whether I decided that or whether the 40 minutes simply passed. He said Kor was consistent. He said that, in his experience, consistency was rarer than volume, that any settlement could produce a good season, but very few could hold the same figures year after year, without variance, and that variance was what triggered secondary review. He said he wished more workmeisters understood this. Then he asked whether I required anything, and I said no, and he said good and left, and his transport lifted off a few minutes later, and I sat back down and finished the day's entries. That was the closest anyone ever came. It was not close. The numbers looked correct, and nobody audits what looks correct. Halgut had not been hiding Kor from the administratum. He had been handing it exactly what it asked for. My daughter turned 18 first. I had the allocation board in front of me, the same board Halgut had looked at when he wrote my name into a rig opening, and that season there was no rig opening. I could have made one. Workmeisters move people. But moving someone off a rig meant putting them on the chem lines in her place, and everyone in Kor would have known by the following evening whose daughter had been favored, and a workmeister people are watching is a workmeister whose desk gets opened. I put her on the chem lines. The chem lines. The same open shed with the same broken ventilation fans where my mother had worked, where I had worked, where Devar Ralt had squinted at me through her chemical-damaged eye and pointed at a row of drums and said, "Those are yours." Deva stayed in that shed because I did not. My daughter stood in it now, measuring compounds from the same drums, breathing the same fumes, and the first time I saw her come home with orange dust in the creases of her knuckles, the same creases, the same orange, I had to leave the room. 2 years later, a rig opening came up and my son turned 18 inside the same month. I wrote his name into it. Rig crews carried the conscription exemption. People noticed. Nobody said anything to me about it, then or afterward, because there was nothing to say that would have changed the board. They were both good workers. They did their shifts and collected their rations and slept in their hab-block rooms and did not ask questions that did not have answers. I was proud of them in the distant, compressed way that I was proud of anything. They were surviving. On Kelvasse, surviving was the entire achievement. I thought about Bren once more after that year, and then I stopped because the Imperium sent me a reason to stop. A supply shipment arrived carrying, among the chemical drums and equipment manifests, a small Munitorum processing packet addressed to the Workmeister of Core. Inside it was a canvas bag containing personal effects to be returned to the next of kin or nearest registered contact of deceased Astra Militarum personnel originating from the settlement. The bag contained 11 identity discs. Bren's was the third one I pulled out, a stamped metal tag on a cord with his name, his serial number, his blood type, and the designation of his regiment, the 4th Kelvassian Levy, which was a regiment I had never heard of because nobody on Kelvasse followed the wars. There was no letter, no explanation of how he died or where or when. Just a disc, returned through channels that had taken so long to process that the metal was oxidized green around the edges. I held the disc for a long time, longer than I had held Marit's hand after she died, if I am being honest. And I am being honest because there is no reason left not to be. I thought about him sitting on the water tank in Core, muttering to himself, telling me stories about meat and oceans and floating cities. I thought about him asking me to keep his rack reserved, and the way we both knew it was a lie, and that the lie was not for him but for me, so that I would have something to hold on to after he was gone. He had been good at that, at giving people small things to carry. I put his disc in the desk drawer, next to Halgut's ledgers, and I did not look at it again, but I knew it was there. The last years were a compression. Time, which had always moved slowly on Kelvasse, began to move in a way that was not faster but thinner, as if the days were being pressed flat, losing their dimension, becoming indistinguishable from each other in a way that made memory impossible. I was 50. Then I was 52. Then I was 54. I know these numbers are correct because the data slates recorded them, but I could not tell you what happened in any specific year because nothing happened that had not happened in every other year. The fields grew, the leviathans harvested, the tithe ships came, the grain went away, the ration bars were 6% smaller than they should have been, the air was the color of old bandages, and I sat in my chair and I maintained the ledgers, and I was the Workmeister of Core. My body started failing in my mid-50s, which was about average for someone with my history of chemical exposure. The tremor in my right hand, the one I had developed on the chem lines at 18, spread to my left hand and then to my arms. My cough deepened. I began to taste blood in the mornings, faintly, like copper, mixed with the permanent orange flavor that had been there so long it was not a flavor anymore but a condition. The medic told me the same thing every medic on Kelvasse told every worker in my condition. The deposits were extensive. The deterioration was progressive. There was no treatment. He said this with the same flat efficiency that Fossek had used 30 years earlier when he had said the same thing to my mother. The words were the same. The outcome was the same. The only difference was that I was on the other side of the desk now. The medic was not delivering a diagnosis. He was delivering a schedule. I kept working. There was no option to stop. Workmeister was not a position you retired from. It was a position you held until you died or until someone replaced you, and no one was going to replace me because no one wanted the job, because the job was maintaining a lie that would destroy the settlement if it stopped being maintained and would slowly kill the settlement if it continued. That was the choice. That had always been the choice. Not between good and bad, but between bad and worse, with the understanding that bad would eventually become worse anyway, just slower. I wonder sometimes where the food goes. I know the official answer. Hive worlds, forge worlds, armies, fleets. The numbers add up. The system functions. We are not the operators of the machine. We are not the fuel. We are the crop. I saw blue sky once, years ago, for 5 seconds through a gap in the haze. I am no longer sure it was real. I am 58 years old. I know this because the data slate says so, and the data slate has no reason to lie, which makes it the only honest record in this office. My hands shake badly enough that entering figures is difficult. My breathing sounds the way Marit's sounded near the end, thin and insufficient, like trying to fill a sack with holes in it. The taste of blood is constant now, not faint, not intermittent, constant. I have begun to notice that the mornings are harder than the evenings, which means the deterioration is accelerating, which means the schedule is ahead of where I expected it to be. My daughter still works the chem lines. She comes to this office once a month to sign for the household allocation, because that is the procedure. And she signs it and takes the bars and goes. We have not said anything to each other in 4 years that was not on the form. My son is on the rigs and has a paired unit registration of his own now, and I see him at the distribution point sometimes, and he nods. They have a daughter. I registered her myself in this office on this data slate because that is what a workmeister does, and because after the census there is no longer any way not to. Designation Core 9612. She will be 8 in 6 years. Last week, a new transport arrived, dust fresh. 43 people blinking in the orange light, holding their kit bags and their administratum assignment papers, looking around with that particular expression that I have now seen hundreds of times and still cannot describe adequately. It is not shock. It is not horror. It is the face of someone whose expectations are being replaced by reality, and the replacement is happening so quickly that both things exist simultaneously for a moment. The paradise of the vidcard and the wasteland of the actual planet, layered on top of each other like a double exposure. It lasts about 30 seconds. Then the vidcard version dissolves and the real version is all that remains, and the face changes, and the person wearing it becomes someone different from the person who stepped off the lander. I assigned them to work details. I distributed their rations. I did not tell them about the 6%. I did not tell them that the bars they were eating were smaller than they should have been. I did not tell them any of the things I know, because knowing those things would not change their situation, and it would change mine. And the lie requires that my situation remain exactly what it is. One of them, a young woman with the clean skin and unbroken posture of someone who had been eating full meals her entire life, asked me how long I had been on Kelvasse. I told her. She asked me what it was like. I told her to ask me again in a year. She will not ask me again in a year because in a year I will probably be dead. And in a year, she will have stopped asking questions like that, because Kelvasse teaches you to stop asking questions that you do not want answered. I entered the yield figures this morning. I inflated them by 6%. I transmitted the report. I do not know if it was the last report I will transmit. I do not know if tomorrow I will be in this chair or if someone else will be sitting here, opening the desk drawers, finding the ledgers, understanding the lie, and deciding, as I decided and as Halgut decided before me, to keep it going. I think they will. I think the lie will outlive me the way it outlived Halgut, because the lie is not a choice anymore. It is a structural component. Remove it and the structure collapses. Maintain it and the structure holds, barely, indefinitely, at the cost of a few percentage points of food from people who are already eating the minimum. There are 16 years left to run on the debt Voskin assessed. I will not see the end of it. Neither will most of the people currently paying it. I will die on Kelvasse. I have always known this, the way you know the color of the air or the taste of the ration bar. It is not a fear. It is not a sadness. It is a fact. I was born on this world, and I will die on this world, and the grain will grow over whatever is left of me, and the Leviathans will harvest it, and it will be processed and sealed and loaded onto a tithe ship and sent somewhere I have never been to feed someone who has never heard of me, on a world I cannot imagine. There is a saying on Kelvasse: you come for the soil, you end up part of it. I did not come for the soil. I was born in it, and part of it is all I have ever been.